Hello YouTubers, I want to welcome you to another edition of Bargain Bin Gear. And I hope you've been following the channel and subscribing. I guess you have to hit a notification bell, I don't know, to basically, because I always refer to previous videos that I've done. And in one of the previous videos, I told you that I was messing around with my big pedal board, which I hadn't really used all that often. I'm just now setting it up. And really, I only have four pedals with MIDI control. Okay. Now there's also a couple of other pedals, but they more affect the tempo and those kinds of things. They don't actually produce sound. Now you would think that setting up this board and making presets would be a simple affair. Right? I mean, you've only got 4 pedals. Can't be that hard, right? Wrong. At least for me. And I mean, it's unbelievable how complex 4 pedals can become. Also very interesting what can be done. Wow. And I mean, I've only scratched the surface. And MIDI is really something very interesting. Now, believe it or not, just to set up my MIDI controller, which is a Soulman, right? MIDI controller. And it has a computer application, so I have to use a computer. Okay. Beyond that, I'm also using an iPad here. And that's to set up the pedals and things. And constantly having to go through manuals and even creating a chart. Right? So I don't get confused as far as what I'm trying to accomplish. Now, in more details, basically with MIDI, right, besides being the name of my cat, MIDI, first and foremost, has program changes. And that's pretty straightforward, right? Program changes is basically if your pedal has MIDI and it has presets, right? And each preset is a different sound, right? Then you would send a program change to the pedal, right? Makes sense. In other words, if I had this sound, and then I hit the controller and it switches to a different sound. I added a delay there. Right? And that's just sending program changes to pedals. Okay. So anyway, those are program changes. Now, beyond that, and those are basically just to switch presets. Beyond that, there's tons of other MIDI commands that you can use. And one of the most important and kind of confusing, really, are continuous controller messages. Right? Now, what a continuous controller message does, it's called a CC message, right? Is individual to the pedal. And what I mean by that is, I've discovered that basically every pedal is a little bit different as far as continuous controllers go. Now, let's say that these two H9s right here, and I'll put them on there, right? You see that? See the two red lights there on the left? That means it's active. Now, when I switch to the M5 here, right there, the green lit pedal, right? And I want that to turn on the bass, but I want these to turn off, right? To be bypassed. And so the way you can do that is with sending a continuous controller message to these two H9s. And there you go. They turn off and the bass pedal turns on. To do that, right, you have to send continuous controller messages to the H9s, right? And one of the continuous controller messages is to either turn the pedal on or turn it off, right? But it's a little tiny bit more complicated than that, because you have to program the Eventide H9s, right, to receive continuous controller messages, in particular bypass, right? And you can assign the controller message, right? So in this case, just to simplify things, for the H9s, right, I just did CC1 will be bypass. So that's programmable. So in other words, if I send a continuous controller message 1, right, it's going to ask, basically the pedals are going to say, okay, do you want me to turn on or turn off? And this is where there's another parameter, right? And basically it's done by a number, right? 127 or 64, right? And that's not all pedals, by the way. This is just for the H9s, right? So 127 would be to turn on, or 64 and below is turn off. So you have 127 or 64, okay? So in total, what you need to send to the H9's continuous controller-wise is first the MIDI channel, right? In other words, what channel does it receive MIDI messages? Okay, and since I have two H9s, they have different MIDI receive channels. In other words, one of them is set to channel 2, and the other one is set to channel 6. Okay, so that's the first parameter. Second parameter, right, is continuous controller 1, right? In other words, asking, do you want to bypass or engage the pedal? And then the second or third thing, I guess, would be whether you want it to turn on or turn off, and you say that by adding a number, okay? 127 or 64. And that's on the H9. Now, here's something interesting. The Line 6M5, for example, does things totally differently, right? On the M5, you cannot program what CC number does. It's already programmed. And to activate or bypass the pedal, right, they use CC11. The Synth 9 from EHX, right, that's been modified for MIDI, uses a control message of 20, right, to bypass or engage. And on the M5 and the Synth 9, instead of 127 or 64, it's actually 127 or 0. So it can get very confusing, as you can imagine. So anyway, I've been messing around with that, and I've discovered some really interesting things here, and I'll show them to you. The first thing I discovered is I wanted a master bypass, right, preset on my MIDI controller, okay, where I can hit the button and all the pedals turn off. And that's all done with continuous controller messages rather than program changes, right, which just switches the presets. So that's continuous controller messages. And for this master bypass, it has to go to 4 pedals, right? So each one has a continuous controller message. And the nice thing is that with the Soulman MIDI controller, right, I can show you that. So here's the Soulman editor right here, and the thing we're focusing on is right here. See that? So this macro, which lets you send multiple continuous controller or program change messages all at once. So this one, it's called bypass, and you'll see all these continuous controller messages, and that's telling every pedal, hey, turn off, bypass, right? And here, right, the foot switch name is BYP for bypass. Message type is macro, and here's the macro on is bypass right there. So those continuous controller messages, right, can be sent to all 4 pedals at once by putting them in a macro and then shooting them off to the pedals when you hit the switch on the MIDI controller to turn off, okay? And this becomes very handy very quickly because when you choose a specific preset, you want certain pedals to be on and certain pedals to turn off, right? Especially if they're already on, you know. Let's say, and that's done with a combination of continuous controllers and messages and program changes to switch the presets. I'll give you an example. So let's say, for example, that here I have the Synth 9 turned on and the 2 H9s turned on, and then here the M5 just doing bass, right? Well, when I play that bass sound, right, I don't want these on, the H9 and the Synth 9, right? The H9s and the Synth 9. I want them to turn off, but keep the bass on, because I want just the bass sound from the M5. And I can do that because watch what happens. I programmed a second preset on the MIDI controller to send a macros, and the macros basically tells the H9s turn off, tells the Synth 9 turn off, and tells the M5, which does the bass sounds, to turn on, right? So watch what happens here. You'll see that these three pedals, right, they turn off. And the M5 turns on for the bass sound. So, again, let's say I had just the two H9s and the synth pedal on and the bass on, it wouldn't sound right, right? You get... What is that? Okay, so that's not going to work. So what you want is to be able to hit that switch to bring up the bass sound and turn off the three other pedals. And you do that again. The program changes to the M5 to switch to the bass sound and activate it. And then the three other pedals are sent continuous controller messages to bypass, right? So we can do that here. And now we get right? So a real clear bass sound. Okay, if that makes sense. Beyond that, since I was messing around with continuous controller messages, I thought to myself, well, when I hit a preset, right, I need to tell each pedal whether to turn on or turn off, right? So example, no matter what state they're in, right? Right now, everything is bypassed except for the bass, right? Because that's what I was playing right here. Okay? Now let's say I wanted to switch to, instead of a bass sound, I want a clean delay sound. Okay? And the clean delay sound are basically the two H9s. Right? So I want to turn on the two H9s and give them program changes to go to the correct preset on each. And then I want it to also tell, via continuous controller, to turn off the two other pedals. Right? The bass and the synth 9. Right? So now switch it. Okay. And now the bass of the Line 6 M5 is turned off. The synth 9 pedal has turned off. It wasn't on anyway, so it stayed off, if you like. Then the two H9s activated and were set to the correct presets. And let me show you that. So here I've got just the delayed guitar, right? Okay, now, with the Soulman MIDI controller, I can hit that button again, and in the past, it's been just on or off, right? In other words, have the pedals on, giving me that sound, right? Or hit it again, and it just turns everything off. However, I tried something different, and something I hadn't done before, and I used a continuous controller message. And it's this. Basically, with this sound, I'm using two H9s, and one of them has the delay, and one of them has the reverb. However, let's say I wanted to turn off the reverb, right? Well, because I can assign a macro when you hit the button again, I've sent a continuous controller message to turn off the reverb and just have the delay. So I have a choice. So here's the one with the reverb. And here's without. And I just hit the button again, and now it's just the delay. Whereas if I hit it again, it activates the reverb. What's nice about that is that all the other pedals are being told to turn off or turn on via the continuous controller message, regardless of what's on. For example, let's say I had the synth sound on, right? So here I'm going to switch again to the delayed sound. And there we go. Okay. And hit it again. Turns off the reverb. So basically, it's a way to control the two H9s and tell the other pedals to turn on or off for right now. And it's kind of interesting because they're using that same switch. Hit it once, and you get the delay on one H9, the reverb on an H9 as well, on the second H9. Hit it again, the same switch, and the reverb will turn off, so you have just the delay. And this is pretty basic stuff. I mean, you can get into individual parameters on each pedal and things. So that'll be really interesting to work out, you know. And I think it's very important, the continuous controller messages, because if you play one sound, right, and the pedal is active, and then you switch to another sound, right, that doesn't use that pedal, even though it's still active, right, you have to turn it off, right? So it's a real nice way to get a lot of control. So I've gotten into this For example, the clean sound is using 2 reverbs on 2 H9s, right? Yeah, you can hear that. And here, hit the button again. I did this via adding a continuous controller message. The second time the foot switch is hit, it bypasses one of the reverbs. It just gives you a different sound. So this is one reverb. If I hit that switch again, it'll turn on the other reverb. So now I have 2 reverbs going. Hit it again, it turns off one of the reverbs. That's 1 reverb. Hit the pedal again, it's 2 reverbs. Now, in the past, basically, I would have a preset that would have a specific sound controlling the pedals, and it would basically on, right, hit the switch again, it would turn off. Okay? And here, because of the continuous controller messages, instead, when I hit a switch, I get the sound, but instead of turning it off, if I hit the switch again, it only turns off one pedal or changes one parameter. Okay? So I basically get a choice rather than just turning it off. And this works really well. However, you have to be sure that for every preset that you make, that you tell all the pedals what they need to do, whether they need to turn off or turn on and that kind of thing, right? If not, you might have a pedal that's on from a previous preset, and when you go to switch to a new preset, well, that pedal's still on, and that'll mess up the sound that you want. Seems kind of basic, but it's actually something pretty new for me, because yeah, as I said in the past, I just used a bypass, right, rather than hitting it again and having it turn off one pedal or a parameter or that kind of thing. Okay? So basically, what I'm getting at is the things that you can do with MIDI, especially with the continuous controller messages, is really, really interesting. So I'm experimenting with that, and I'm really pleased so far that it works as I intended to, and I really have control over those 4 pedals, right? As far as what I want them to do when I hit a switch, you know, more than, you know, just changing presets, for example. So a combination of continuous controller messages and program changes can let you do a lot of really neat things and really have control over your pedals. Okay, now there's more that can be done. And what I also discovered, every pedal, when it comes to CC messages, is a little bit different. You know, there's no standardization, really. For example, as I said, the synthesizer pedal, to turn it on and off, is continuous controller message 20, right? Whereas the Line 6M5, the on-off controller message is actually 11. Who knows why? That's just the way they did it, as far as I know. Now, remember, each pedal is assigned a MIDI receive channel, right? So in other words, when I send all 4 messages, right, those 4 messages go to specific pedals. In other words, specific MIDI channels, right? Or else you'd have them, you know, send one message and it would, all the pedals would react to it, right? Whereas here, this is not what you want. You want it, individual pedals to receive certain instructions, right? And each one has a different instruction. And with MIDI, of course, you can have up to 16 messages. Oh, I'm sorry, MIDI channels. In other words, 16 pedals you could control that way. If you set a macros, you know, and in the macros you'd have program changes and controller messages to all the pedals, you know, or certain pedals. Okay, there's one other thing I want to mention. And this throws off a lot of people. And it's kind of because things aren't really standardized, you know, for example, on the H9, right? Because of the way that the presets are organized, right? Let's say I wanted preset 62, right? Well, you would think you would just send a program change, right, of whatever MIDI channel it is. Let's say channel 6, right? So that'll send it to my second H9. And let's say I want preset 62. Well, you would think you would put 62, right? But no, because it starts out on the H9 with preset 0, So you would actually put 61, right? So it's basically one off the actual preset number you want. Kind of bizarre that way. And a lot of pedals do this. Something to keep in mind. One other thing is the you can't create a MIDI map, you know, but I haven't even gotten into that yet. So anyway, so when I want preset 62, I put in preset 61 on the Soulman macros, right, to send a program change 61, which will actually bring up preset 62. Can be very confusing. So with all that information, I created a little chart here. It's nothing complicated, but it just tells me what channel and what controller message to turn it on or off, right? And the data number that turns it on or turns it off. And you see I've already had made one mistake here, right? Confusing it for another pedal. So for example, M5 CC11 turns it on or off. Synth 9 CC20 turns it on or off depending on this number, 0 or 127, right? So I did that for the 4 pedals. Who knew that 4 little pedals could be so complicated? Right? Now granted, I'm sure there are experts out there, you know, who know everything about MIDI, and this is just basic stuff. But for me, you know, in the past I just used MIDI really for preset changes, you know, program changes. In other words, preset 1, hit a button and access preset 27, whatever. So really getting into using the CC messages, the continuous controller messages, is quite interesting for me, and seeing what can be done with it. You know, I mean, you can access certain parameters and so on and so on. And here, this is still pretty basic because there's a lot more that you can do. But for right now, this seems to be working for me here. You know, the use of combination of program changes and continuous controller messages. Alright, well anyway, if you have a MIDI controller, you should really try to spend time with it, you know, and see what functions are available, you know, because usually with MIDI you can do much more than just switching presets. So something to explore, possibly. Alright, very good. See you next time. Okay, bye.